Thanks for joining us for this episode of Got Your Six Lads Advice Encounters with me, Gav Topley and Friends. Today I'm joined by a fascinating guest, Dr. Mike Martin. Mike is a visiting research fellow at the Department of War Studies at King's College London. He also has a biology degree from the University of Oxford. He's fluent in Pashtu, having served as an officer in the British Army in Afghanistan, where he pioneered the Army's Cultural Advisor Programme. He is the author of An Intimate War and of Crossing the Congo, which was shortlisted for the 2016 Edward Stanford Travel Writing Award. Mike conducted the first motorised crossing of the Congo River Basin since the 1960s, and in his latest book, Why We Fight, he brings together an interdisciplinary approach to understanding global conflict. Mike, thanks for joining us. It's great to have you on the podcast.
Thanks very much. God, that was such a mouthful of an introduction.
There's lots there, isn't there? And actually, we spoke several weeks ago, didn't we, about doing the podcast. I wanted to read the book first. And actually, the more I've read the book, the more I've thought, there's far too much material here to fit into a podcast. So I guess we'll hone in. Could you start by telling us just a little bit about yourself and your background, and so we sort of get to know you and your motivations and where you're coming from with all of this?
Yeah. So I did biology originally at university, and then after university, I spent 3 years. I guess my dad called it dossing around. Worked as a chef in France. Polished up my French, went and lived in South America, learned Spanish, and ended up sailing across the Atlantic, which is where I'd never sailed before that, but I sort of picked up a love of sailing at that point, ocean sailing. And then I came back, joined the army, learned Pashtu, as you said, spent 6 years in the army, a couple of years in Helmand, working as a political officer. And then did various things after that. So worked in various conflict zones in a risk management firm, sort of commercializing what I'd done in the army. So helping organizations understand the environment, the conflict environments that they're operating in. So, what are the frozen conflicts? If I'm an oil company and I'm going to this area, what do I need to know? And then came back and worked for a global NGO called Common Purpose, who do cross-cultural leadership, worked again for the government, doing conflict stuff, written various books along the way. And right now, my wife and I are circumnavigating the world in a 35-foot sailboat. So we're halfway around at the moment. The boat's in Fiji. We're back. We got our first child on the way in a month, so we're going to have the kids, and then we're going to go back to the boat, pick up the boat, and sail it back to the UK from Fiji.
I was about to say, before you said that there, you have a baby on the way, as well. Yeah. So you're just taking a pause from that adventure.
Well, it's not. I mean, the Fijian healthcare system's actually really good. I mean, it's fine, but. We're really lucky to have the NHS. It's great, and obviously be near family and friends and stuff.
Absolutely. So how long will the break be, do you think, before you get back on the...
We're going to go back when the kid's about 4 months. So the initial vaccination for infants in the UK is 16 weeks. You have sort of several vaccinations over 16 weeks, and by that, the immune system's sorted and, sorted enough to get on a sailboat and sail across the oceans.
Wow. Okay. So I guess the first big leap in that timeline then is from biology to the army. What motivated that? Where did that come from?
They're not linked. I always wanted to fight. And, when I was growing up, my reading material was either explorers like Wilfred Thesiger or military type books like Beaugest or King Solomon's Mines or stuff like that, where you basically got groups of people who are going out to try and achieve some sort of effect, and there's a mixture of politics and military, really. And so I guess in my mind's eye, I think I always really knew that I would be a soldier of some sort, or at least I'd give it a go. I mean, I probably wasn't never going to make general, but I thought I'd give it a go. And why did I do biology? I did biology because, we were just saying before the podcast, I liked biology. I found it fascinating. And I had a really good teacher at A level who said to me, "You must do biology at university." And that sort of planted a seed for me. And I thought, I'll do. And I'll never look back. I think biology, and particularly the concept of evolution and the theory of evolution by natural selection, is one of the most beautiful and elegant pieces of science that humans have come up with. And to have one theory that explains all life as we currently understand it in this biosphere is an extraordinary thing. And I just find it's so powerful.
And I think there's a bit of a theme here, isn't it, in terms of you being a bit of a trailblazer, but also it's quite interesting, the idea of synchronicity and things happening for a reason, because now, of course, in your latest book, you managed to bring that together with an interdisciplinary approach and with your experiences in Afghanistan to sort of bring a bigger picture look at war. When you're in the army, it sounds like you had a pretty unique role there. Can you talk a bit about that?
So I mentioned I was a political officer. My job was to sit down and drink tea with people, and from across the political spectrum. So whether they were, in the Afghan government, so those are our allies, or perhaps they might be tribal leaders or village heads, or including other end of the spectrum, Taliban commanders, drug traffickers, whatever. We needed to know who the movers and shakers were in Al-Mahdi society, and that was my job. My job was literally to build relationships with those people, and then either use those relationships to understand Al-Mahdi society or to try as much as we could to influence them. So it was a two-way communications thing. And I was the first one. So I launched that idea of using linguists to, not just to, previously the army had seen linguists as a sort of interpreters, but actually the rarity of an officer and they were mostly officers who spoke fluent Pashtu, who were then had sufficiently good social skills and analytical skills and stuff to build those relationships. We could do so much more with that, and that's what we did. That's what we tried to do. And in the end, so from that initial in 2008, when I proposed that as an idea, it then got taken up, and then the army set in train, or the military, I should say, set in train the training programs and such like, and set up a unit called Defence Cultural Specialist Unit to provide these people to the units in theatre. And even now, what are we now, 2022, so 8 years after the Brits pulled out of Helmand, the DCSU still exists as a subunit in 77 Brigade. So that's that idea of using, I don't really want to use the word expert, but people who are more clued up about a particular region by dint of speaking the language, and they've done some study on that region and so on and so forth, using that knowledge to help us understand those environments that we operate in, and to enable us to operate in a more nuanced way when we get there, rather than just blundering about and trying to kill everyone that we need to kill. It gives you a lot more options if you understand what the social political environment is when you go into somewhere like Afghanistan or Mali, Yemen, Burma, anywhere that you're fighting internal conflict. You need to understand what's going on. And
that was something I was going to comment really, was that it's a lot more than sort of just the language skills, and you commented on some of the broader skills that are needed there. But I guess if you were the first in that role, understanding the local context and the sort of cultural differences and even the sort of micro cultural differences in the different areas that you went to would have been quite important. How do you, as the first person in, acquire that knowledge? Is it sort of learn as you go, or is there a way of sort of researching that beforehand?
It's quite hard to describe how you did it yourself, because you just did it, right? You just up and did it. But I think so. I went backwards and forwards to Helmand over a period of 4 years. I spent 2 years in Helmand, and that was 6 months here or 9 months there, and so on and so forth, sort of backwards and forwards. And I guess it was a mixture between practical and theory, right? You know, before I went the first time, I obviously read a lot of books about Afghanistan. Then I went and tried to apply some of that to speaking to people. And then I came back and had further questions and did more research. Perhaps I did some further, maybe I went to the British Library and got some documents of British political officers in the 1800s or something, and then I went back to Helmand and spoke to more people, and then so you start to narrow the gap between the conversations you're having and the books that you're reading. And I think initially they probably start out quite wide, but I think the thing that draws it together is curiosity, right? Like this childlike curiosity to work out what's going on, what's driving that conflict, why are these people fighting each other, fighting us, and that, you know, as long as you feel that sense of curiosity, you're pulled into all of those conversations to try and understand what's going on in their world. And then when you're back in the UK, you're like, there's something that's not quite right. Maybe I'll go over here. You know, brilliant. There's some text that helps us explain that. But particularly with an area like Helmand, so there's obviously a lot written about Afghanistan. I think what I would say is 98% of what's written about Afghanistan, particularly in the most recent post-2001 era, is written by people who aren't in Afghanistan, haven't been to Afghanistan, certainly don't speak the language. Like, I would not necessarily call these people experts in Afghanistan, but because there was so much money sloshing around in the post-2001 era, there was a lot of words written about Afghanistan, not necessarily that good. A lot of it was recycled. You know, you'd see the same trope come up again and again and again, and you'd be like, that's where that entered the narrative, and then we can see these people have just carried it on and on and on. And then if you look at an area like Helmand, which is A, nobody went there because it was so violent. B, 90% of Helmandis are illiterate, or 95% of Helmandis are illiterate. C, it's inaccessible, etc., etc. So there was nothing written about Helmand. And everything, and particularly the society, everything that was written about Helmand was written through the eyes of NATO fighting an insurgency there. But there was nothing written from the perspective of the local population, how they were organised, what they thought. You know, nobody had sat down and had those conversations. So again, it's sort of a theme that we were speaking about earlier, is a lot of people write stuff without ever having gone there and actually sat down and spoken to people and asked them, well, what is it that you think's going on here?
Mm-hmm. And I think it might have actually been one of your Twitter threads. It may not have been, but I think it probably was, talking about this in terms of, we've got these great big libraries full of books with lots of information, and yet we sort of deployed having not really re-looked at them. And even if we had looked at them, then the information there might not be so accurate. Whereas sort of on the ground in Afghanistan, you know, the local people had got more of a sort of a verbal history and shared storytelling, and were therefore, as a result of that, far more sort of clued into what was going on and what the outcomes and strategies might be than we were. Was that your...
Yeah, well, they were illiterate. Many of them were illiterate, but they remember. So if I think about a battle between, you know, the Brits and some Helmandis in the 1800s, if I was speaking in 2010 to somebody who was 70, then they might remember their grandfather telling them about something that happened in the late 1800s, and that might be one bound, or maybe perhaps their father, but you know, it's not that far back. You know, you can remember these stories. I can remember things that my grandfather told me, right? He was born in Ireland, Northern Ireland, or what was then British Ireland, in fact, he was born in. I can remember things that he told me, and I will, I'm sure, tell my grandchildren those things, right? But they had a very good idea of, even down to, you know, you the Brits, you came here, and then you did this, and then, you know, you were allied with that particular clan over there. Yeah. And they knew, for instance, well, our rebellion against you, was led by these two guys, and their descendants are now Taliban commanders.
Right. Yeah.
Right. It's that guy and that guy over there. They're Taliban. Whereas we had absolutely no idea of any of this. And like you say, what's more, you go to the British Library, which is one of the biggest, most impressive libraries in the world. And only 5 tube stops, by the way, from the Ministry of Defence, housing of the intelligence apparatus through which we sought to understand Afghanistan. And nobody had bothered. When I went in 2011 to pull up the diaries of the political officers who'd been there in the late early 1800s, they hadn't been pulled out of the stacks, so where the books are stored, since the 90s. So since before, and this 2011, right? So we've been in Helmand for 5 years, we've been in Afghanistan for 10 years. Nobody had thought we should go and get the diaries of the political officers who've been to that area before. Like, it's pathetic.
That's fairly staggering, isn't it? In a role where you've become, by necessity, up close and personal with people living in Afghanistan, and that, perhaps might have been put at risk by the withdrawal, how you sort of reconciled that with what's gone on in terms of the way that we have withdrawn. That was the first part of the question. And the second part was, people have memories. So what's going to be the knock on for potential future conflicts in that area?
Yeah, for potential future conflicts in that area. Oh God, please let's not. Please, Britain, please let's not get involved in Afghanistan again. So, look, I was quite careful. I don't know whether I had a premonition or what. I was really, and it's probably a nature of the work that I did, where, whilst as much as possible I tried to act as an honest broker, I was also a British officer there to carry out the policies of the United Kingdom, right? So inevitably there will be times where I had to make decisions or do things that wouldn't necessarily accord with my interlocutors, right, on the other side.
Yeah.
And I think because of that, I was quite careful in keeping a barrier between myself and my contacts, because I think I probably subconsciously, but it appears now I had quite a good idea that there might come a separation like this, where and to have to then cope with this in the light of having built up close relationships would be much more difficult. So I was quite careful not to allow, I had a barrier up, I guess, to protect myself. That was made a lot easier by the fact that I was quite sure that almost everyone that I dealt with would have killed me had they been alone with me in a room without me being armed and then being able to get away with it. Because of the breadth of the contacts that I had, and also because of the generalized antipathy of Afghans, but particularly of Helmandis, towards the British. In a sense, as a British officer, this doesn't mean that we weren't able to build very productive relationships, that we were able to negotiate plenty of things, but I never mistook that for a warmth of a personal friendship. Sure. Because I was quite clear, like I said, I think they would have killed me had they had the chance, many of them. And I, as I've just said, I think I was aware that it might end badly, so I needed to keep myself separate. So in that regard, I was able to stay separated, and it probably made me more able to do my job as well, because of the breadth of people that I was speaking to and the breadth of issues that I was having to talk to them and negotiate with them on. There is one exception to that. There is one person who is actually a British Afghan friend of mine, but originates in Helmand, and he spent much of the time that I was in Helmand going backwards and forwards, and our paths crossed many times doing lots of things, and he actually ended up trapped in Afghanistan as it fell, and as you know, the Foreign Office collapsed and was useless, and you'd think that having a British passport would help you. No. And so I did actually go into action for him and managed to get him out, which was good. And then there's sort of a number of other tangential cases where I was able to link people up and help people. But there was one, it was his case that I was particularly focused on, and he definitely got out because of the path that I strung together for him. There were some others that I sort of helped out with tangentially. What was your second question? It was about
the knock-on effect of the way that Afghanistan has been drawn down on any future conflict in that area.
I mean, I'd like to say I don't think that Western countries are going to get involved in Afghanistan again, but I dare say that Glasnost Disraeli said that in the 1880s. I think broadly, I think the world's changing, isn't it? I think that as much as China is trying to resist getting sucked into Afghanistan, I suspect it will become inevitable in the sense that China and Afghanistan obviously share a border. But more than that, China seeks connectivity across Eurasia. You've seen the sort of Belt and Road Initiative, all that kind of stuff. And more than it seeks, I think, a maritime empire. I mean, if you look through history, the Dutch, the Brits, the Portuguese, the Americans, to an extent, these have all been empires that have hinged upon mastery of the sea. And I'm not convinced that, I think China sees itself as a continental power, a land power, rather than a maritime power. I think that's in its self-conception. In the same way that I think, the French and the Germans as well, were continental powers rather than maritime powers. And there's obviously obvious reasons for that around geography. And, if you're a small island, then you want to be a maritime power, right? And obviously America is its own continent, so it has to be a maritime power. But I think China sees itself as a continental power. So it seeks connectivity across Eurasia, and it's impossible for, if you look at the map of Eurasia, if you look at where Afghanistan is, I cannot see a way that China can really stitch together that connectivity without engaging in Afghanistan. So I think at the moment they're holding back to see what's going to happen. And I think they're pretty pissed off with, they were told a bunch of stuff before the Afghan government fell at the end of August about, inclusive government and all this kind of stuff, anti-terrorism, blah, blah, blah. And I think they feel a bit pissed off that hasn't really happened post, with the new Taliban government. So we'll see. I think they're holding off. They've got other things on their mind at the moment as well, with Taiwan and all that kind of stuff. But I think that Afghanistan is definitely in the to-do list for China, in the sense of thinking about how do we solve this policy problem, right? Then the status quo as it is not going to endure. And I think that's much more likely than, some sort of Western future intervention, at least in the next 50 years. I can't see, the pendulum has to swing to China and then away from China again. I can't see that happening in the next 30 to 50 years.
Do you think that in the way that China operate, is that going to be potentially a military, or is it more like sort of a soft power investment and
I mean, I think, I don't know what method. I mean, in a sense, you're asking me what their method will be. I don't really know that, but in a sense, that will be tempered based on what their aims are. I think what's interesting is that China is, in its current conception, is the most statist of states, right? It's everyone gets a number and you can collect social credit and you've got to turn up at this time. It's a very, very authoritarian. Everyone is swappable, outable from all the other people. Individualism is not a thing in China as conceived at the moment by the CCP. And Afghanistan is the most individualistic country you'll ever come across. Every Afghan is a man or woman unto themselves. obviously particularly men, because of the, many Afghan, the idea of gender equality is not really a thing in Afghanistan, so mostly Afghan men, but there's certainly, many Afghans don't accept the overlordship of other Afghans, and that's partly a result of the ecology of the country is highly fragmented between different valleys and mountain ranges and deserts and all the rest of it, right? So it's hard to stitch together a higher level polity in that country. So you've got lots of different languages and tribes and ethnicities that all think that they're their own kings. I mean, this is why it's so hard to build a country out of the place. And Afghans themselves have found that difficult. Foreigners find it even more difficult. But China is the type of outsider with this statist, one-size-fits-all approach that's least likely to succeed in someone like Afghanistan. Perhaps they've had the self-awareness to realise that. I doubt it. I think there's a lot of Chinese hubris at the moment. I think they think that the West is decadent and decline. I think Putin and Xi at the moment, have this idea of the West being decadent and declining, and it's just a matter of time before those guys can get on top. And so I don't think they've realised that the statist approach isn't going to work in Afghanistan. I think they're just waiting to see what's going to happen, and they've got some more higher priority issues. That's a very long way of answering your question. I don't think the West is going to be back for the next 50 years.
Sure. Okay. But then I guess if we are, the issue is that, long memories. So perhaps there's impact there. If in 50 years,
they'll remember. Yeah. The Afghans will remember. Well, the Afghans will remember, and they'll remember stuff like, you flew all the dogs out before you flew the Afghans out in the fall of, all the pen fighting stuff.
And I guess that was some of the stuff that I was getting at, really, in terms of, it was sort of some confusion as to the mission in Afghanistan anyway from the outset. Was it anti-terrorism? Was it the Taliban were oppressing the local population?
That's right. Blah blah. Yeah,
exactly that. And so for the soldiers on the ground, then sort of almost overnight, it turning into a full withdrawal. How to reconcile that when if you've been in that theatre of operations, you've built relationships with local people and you've lost friends, and then the policy changes, and as a member of a nation state's military, you go along with that policy. That I would imagine must be quite difficult for quite a lot of people.
I think you'll have obviously come across this idea of moral injury, which is very loosely, I don't know the exact definition of it, but loosely it's this idea that human beings like to fight for moral reasons, right? We like to fight for good things. Mostly, and obviously there are psychopaths and whatnot, but mostly we like to fight for good things. And when you find out that the thing you've been fighting for, that you've been told is a good thing, and by fighting for, I mean put your life at risk, and you might have been injured, and some of your mates might have been injured, you had to patch them up, or maybe some of your mates got killed, and so you fought for this thing that's a good thing. And then later on, let's put the withdrawal to one side for the moment, which is kind of collapse of that thing you were fighting for. But even before you get to that point, there's this idea of, well, it actually all turned out to be bollocks because it was confused and whatever. And actually, we were never going to bring democracy to someone like Helmand's because people can't read, right? And you need to be able to read. Democracy requires literate people. Or fully functioning democracy requires literate people, and so you start to see, and I've met a lot. I'm sure you have as well. I've met a lot of people who've spent time in Iraq or Afghanistan, these wars that were given such sharp moral contrast when we were sent to fight them, and then we came back and found out it was all bollocks. Or perhaps when we were there, we realised it was bollocks. And then you have the final insult to injury, which is the collapse, right? Like, not only was it all bollocks, but like it was a waste of time as well. Like we didn't even achieve anything. Like it's literally back to the status quo. £44 billion, 457 lives, British lives, probably 10,000 Helmandis, maybe 2,000 British very seriously injured, tens of thousands with mental kind of, echoes or problems from that, vast cost and expense, for literally fuck all. That's incredibly difficult to deal with. And I think what makes it worse is those who were there, who didn't have any agency when they were there. So I'm thinking private soldiers who stag on mate with the Valen, you off you go. And because, the fear that accompanies that, walking in front of a patrol with the Valen metal detector, listening for the whoop, whoop, and then getting down and digging, and just, is it going to be an ID or is it a washer or a screw that someone's left there? Complete lack of agency, but you're not stupid, and you understand you've been given the sharp moral contrast about the war, but actually you probably know that it's also bollocks, or certainly 3/4 of the way through your tour you're like, this is bullshit. And that's I think the worst combination. Whereas I was lucky, relatively lucky, in the sense that yes, I had the patrolling and that kind of stuff, but actually I had quite a lot of agency because I was an officer, but more than that, I was a political officer who spoke Pashtu. So I was able to, I'm going over there to have this meeting, I'm going on this patrol to meet these people in that village and talk to them. Like, I was able to control my own, and I was able to use that to navigate the landscape and explore it. That, I think, protected me quite a lot from those experiences. And even so, I came back from my time in Afghanistan, and I was really fucking angry about the total pointlessness of it, like completely fucking pointless. And that, I think even now, if you get me going on Afghanistan now about, people who know me know that they can push a button and I'll go, and it's fine, I'm fine. But that took time to, I actually went walking for a month after I finished Afghanistan, and wrote every day about my experiences. And after about 3 weeks, I sat down doing my morning writing, and I was going to go walking, and I just wrote about half page, and I suddenly thought, I think that's done now. And I've never picked up that book of notes again. Like, that was just done. That was and then both writing An Intimate War and Why We Fight was a sort of a higher level catharsis around trying to, I guess, this is who I am, I intellectualize to understand emotions, right? So that for me was what worked. I wrote those books to try and understand what had happened, and that through that process gradually helped me kind of put some of that anger away. But like I said, I was lucky, right? I was equipped, I was in a good position, I was, able to pursue it in maybe an intellectual or an educated way. Much harder if you haven't had that agency in that job, and you're just told to do this, do that, and then your mate gets blown up, and then, it's very, very difficult.
And as you know, the podcast came out of a group on Facebook that's aimed at peer support for young men who might struggle to access, various types of help. And at any time, 30 to 50% of the people on that group are military, either serving or veterans. Is there any advice that you'd give if you say you are that private soldier that's come back from Afghanistan and is struggling with these difficulties? Is there any advice that you could give if they're listening to this?
Well, obviously, there's always people to speak to, whether it's your mates or your brother or your sister or your mum or your dad or your uncle or whoever it is that you're close to. That's the first line. And if you don't want to speak to any of them, then of course there are a lot of other more professional or semi-official, avenues that you can go down. And I guess you've got that on your website. You've got the links of all those organisations and stuff. I guess the other thing I'd say is that what you did wasn't a waste. All right, you went there with your platoon or your company or your battalion, and what you did had meaning because you were going there as a band of brothers, of men, of people, and your actions out there kept your mates alive, and you worked together, and the meaning that you got from that you gave to that through your actions will always be within that group of people that you went there with. And I think that's quite separate to the kind of higher United Kingdom foreign policy aims, you know. Inevitably, in any piece of foreign policy, there's going to be stuff that works and stuff that doesn't work, and stuff that works quite well and stuff that doesn't really work quite so well. And, you know, it's not all going to work. And when we all joined the army, we signed up for that in a sense. We're going to be professional soldiers. We're going to do what the government tells us to do. I don't think we'd want it any other way, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't be living in the UK if the soldiers didn't do what the government told it to do. And so I think there's a separation between the kind of wider piece around, did my actions contribute to a successful foreign policy outcome? I don't think that's a question. I don't even think that's a very valid question to ask. I think because that is in the right, you know, that's at a much higher level beyond our individual actions. You know, even I had a very influential role where I was advising the general who ran our operations. I advised 4 of them in a row. I started up a new capability, yada, yada, yada. I had a fuck all effect on what was going on. That foreign policy was already set in Washington and it was set in London. Did I make a difference to the people that I served with? And are some of them alive because of what I did? Yes. So therefore, what I did a good job, and I did the best I could, and we got meaning out of that. And I think it's a separate issue to the wider UK foreign policy.
And in terms of that, when we're sort of looking at the content of the book, and the disconnect between sort of the rational responses around conflict and war and a more sort of unconscious or driven response to war, do you think that, is there a disconnect with politicians having, particularly if they've not served or been in those environments, that is that a problem or a benefit in terms of the decision making on foreign policy?
I think politicians would probably be less keen to use soldiers had they soldiered themselves, because I think, I mean, even if you put aside this idea that, you know, they'd understand that the worst can happen and therefore you should only, you know, risk soldiers where you really need to. I think that's one aspect of it, but I don't even think that's the most important. I think the most important one is actually, once you've soldiered, you realise what the art of the possible is. And you realise that soldiers are great for some things and they're completely rubbish for other things, right? Soldiers have a USP, which, and obviously I include, you know, airmen and sailors and marines and all the rest of it in that word soldier. But, you know, soldiers have a USP, which is using lethal violence, right? They're the only bit of government that can use lethal violence abroad, right? So the question is, where is lethal violence a useful thing that we wish to use in the pursuit of our policy goals? And I think sometimes when politicians haven't had military experience, and it's not just for everyone who hasn't served, doesn't necessarily understand that, because there's a degree of, I think, the military and soldiers being put up on a pedestal as being heroes or whatever, they seem to think that they're super people and they can do everything. Oh, they'll fix Afghanistan, or they'll fix, you know, but actually they can't. They have this particular USP, which is using lethal violence. And they're also quite useful, like if you've got some floods in Cumbria, because they can work 24 hours a day and they don't need hotels and they can just pitch up in a field and sort stuff out. But actually they're not, that's a very short-term thing in Cumbria and it's their own country. Like actually when you go to somewhere like Afghanistan, they're much less useful. And I just think, I don't think politicians understand that there's a bit of a kind of a hero thing going on, which is not necessarily that helpful. I think it suits politicians to hold the military up as heroes, because they hitch their bandwagon onto that the flag or whatever. But it's not very. I don't think it's actually that helpful to the military, because basically you're either a hero or you're a victim, right? The public and politicians view the military either as heroes or victims, and that's not very helpful to people who are serving in the military, because I think many of us were just doing a job, right? We might. Yes, perhaps we joined because we wanted to serve our country, or perhaps we just wanted to join because we wanted to prove ourselves as men, right? There's a broad variety of reasons that people join the military. Perhaps we joined because we couldn't get any other job, or perhaps we joined because if we hadn't joined the army, we were going to end up in prison because we were tearaways, or whatever it is. But I think to paint everyone as a hero, or people as a villain, victims of politicians' choices, is unhelpful, because I think it masks the actual reasons why people are in the military and why they join the military.
Mm-hmm. And I know there was an interview yesterday with Andrew Fox by Jeremy Kyle, talking about this in terms of that social capital, almost, if you like, and politicians sort of attaching themselves to that, and sort of political careers being able to be turned around by a conflict. Perhaps there being a danger of that happening to distract from other things. Do you think that's sort of a bit too far into conspiracy theory, or do you think that is something that goes on?
I know it's kind of apocryphal, isn't it? We need a good war to save the ex-political party. I mean, sure. I mean, it's pretty standard of political effect, isn't it? The rally around the flag thing, where you. I mean, I don't think that's what's going on in Ukraine. I think that's a separate thing that we can talk about if you like. I think it's been very convenient for the current government, which is obviously having a few problems, but I don't necessarily think that's what's driving their actions, because ultimately, the Americans and the French and the Germans have gone along with the same plan as us, so it's they're not it's not in their interest to necessarily to save our government. Macron, for instance, is he and Boris don't get on, so I don't think he'd necessarily step in to save Boris's bacon. I do think there is this social capital thing is massive, and it's the same with the NHS as well. Like, politicians love to put themselves alongside, the clap for carer stuff and all that stuff, and I just think it's just bullshit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in some ways, I guess there is that argument that if you were to go down that line of inquiry in terms of being seen to give moral support, and therefore not having to give something perhaps more tangible in terms of support.
Right. How about a ventilator?
Right, for sure. Let's not go too far down that route. The inside cover of your book, Why Do We Fight Wars? The world in the 2020s is one where instability, war, and societal breakup seem close, but surely we've learned the lessons of the past, and surely peace will continue. So do you think that peace will continue, or is there a future conflict that you can foresee happening?
I think there's something going on in the Sahel. If you look at what's going on in Africa at the moment, it's really interesting. Like Wagner, which is this Russian mercenary group linked to an oligarch who's mates with Putin. Like they've got like 7,000 people in Libya, and they've just sponsored both of the coups. So there've been two coups, lots of coups recently in Africa, but two recent ones that are pertinent to this are one in Burkina Faso, one in Mali. French pulling out of Mali. They used to have 5,000 troops there on a counter-terrorism mission, and now they've just had these coups, and Wagner, this PMC, are in a really strong position. So now you've got Russian strong position in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Libya. If you combine that, if you look at that region over the next 20, 30 years, the population is going to double, and it's going to get absolutely fucked by climate change. Like the Sahel band across Africa is going to be one of the worst hit areas in the world for climate change, desertification. So that's going to cause or exacerbate existing conflicts there and create new conflicts and create huge migration flows. And Russia, by putting itself in those positions, is in a position like it was in Belarus, like Erdogan was with the Syrian refugees, where they can turn off the refugee tap to Europe. And so, Putin's not stupid. He sort of tries one thing here and then that's interesting. Let's say, okay, let's try something over here and see what happens. He's very, very good at like switching it up. And because he's a single actor who's making individual decisions, he's able to act quite quickly. Whereas by dint of design, NATO and EU are very strong when they get everyone aligned. Like that, the beauty of the West is we all agree, once we get everyone agreed, the West is unstoppable because they're rich, they've got big militaries, all the rest of it. The Americans have an extraordinary large air force. But it takes time to get everyone lined up, right? And so that's why Putin is sort of dancing around. And if you look at the way the Russians think about how to do strategy, they place great emphasis on strategic deception. So stuff like this that I've just spoken about with Wagner in the Sahel is exactly the sort of thing they go for. And then it takes a while for the EU to lumber or NATO to lumber and get their shit together, and then eventually they will, and then it's fine, and then Putin will go off and do something else.
So would you suggest a non-military approach maybe for the West in that respect, in terms of, looking at population growth and looking at climate change? Is that what we ought to be doing to sort of head that off, or what's the...
I'm not really sure how deploying Western militaries to the Sahel helps with the long-term problems. It's treating the symptoms, isn't it? Jihadism and terrorism in the Sahel is a symptom of the underlying problem, which is population growth times climate change times shit governments. Those are the causes. Terrorism or militants or smuggling, human trafficking, whatever, those are all symptoms of that problem. So deploying our military there is like treating the symptoms rather than the causes. Western foreign policy is incredibly short-sighted.
I know you wrote on prevent and some thoughts on that. Could you speak a bit about
that? With regard to what? So prevent being the UK's approach to counter-terrorism?
Yeah, and how that sort of jives with your thesis on what causes conflict and war and people to be drawn to it.
Well, again, I think there's a in things like prevent, and I know they've tried to correct this. I think at least initially, and probably still now, there's an overemphasis on the role of ideology in causing violence. A bit like when we look at the Sahel, we see terrorists rather than people who've been pushed off their land. And I think when you really dig into the phenomenon of terrorism, so look at the ISIS lone wolves or something in the late 2010s. Like, I think a lot of those, when you look at those, actually the role of ideology was much diminished compared to what we thought. And actually you've got a bunch of people who are maybe lacking family, or they've been part of a gang that they've had to leave. So there's this lack of a sense of belonging to a cohesive social group, and they sort of latch on to the jihadi narrative as a way of fulfilling their sense of belonging. And so then the question is, when you come to like, how do we counter that? Like, counter ideology is not the thing. The thing that we can do is help people feel like they belong. Like, we need to make sure that government policy is aligned around making sure that people feel like they belong.
And I guess there's lots of scholarship and research on this idea of connection. And I know there's a very long-term longitudinal study at Harvard that looks at having meaningful connections, leading to all sorts of really positive outcomes. But I guess by definition of connection and inclusion, then there has to come othering and exclusion in terms of, you care most about maybe your partner and your kids, and then your wider family, and then your street, your town, your country, so on and so forth. And at some point in those structures, there's going to be another group that that is in conflict with the interests of one of those groups, and then from there is, I guess, the potential for conflict.
Yeah. Until somebody works out how to define a group such that it encompasses the whole of humanity. I mean, this is, if you think about it, this is the development. If you look over meta history, look over 10,000 years, we've gradually come up with better ideas that enable us to draw a bigger and bigger circle. Originally, all we could do was, this is my family. And then we worked out how to be like, oh, they're slightly more extended relatives, so we'll call that a tribe. And then we're like, okay, let's bring in some land ownership, then we can build a chieftainship, and so on and so forth. And now we've worked out how to build nation states, and perhaps we've worked out how to build blocks of countries like the West or Europe, the EU, whatever. So we're getting quite good at coming up with ideas that enable us to build these mega groups. But really the next stage is working out, because you're right, you can't have an in-group without an out-group. By definition, it's the same mechanism in our brains. What's the set of ideas that we use to create a global group? What's the narrative for that global group? And no one's necessarily come up with that yet.
I guess, maybe religion was an attempt at that, do you think? In terms of some of the
it was, wasn't it? But yeah, I mean, how many Christians are there on the planet? How many Muslims are there on the planet? Sure. I mean, these are huge groups, right? These are huge groups.
Absolutely. And so, yeah, I mean, the idea then, as far as you can see, in terms of moving forward now as a human race, if you like, in terms of trying to avoid conflict, is a bigger picture with more of a sort of a cosmopolitan outlook.
I think that's the story of the next 30 years. I think that's what we're looking at. We're, the structures that we had governing the world post World War II are breaking down. They're no longer functioning. Plus we've, growth of the internet and everything that brings, and the transnationalism that comes with that. And we haven't worked out how to tax people properly and look after data, and you've got the dark web and crypto stuff and this and that. And so we don't have the legal systems, the frameworks, the regulations, the ideas to govern the offline world or the online world. That's always happened, by the way, in humanity. We've come up with new technologies that have changed the world, and then later on there's a lag, and later on the regulation and the laws come in to kind of regulate that world. So that's fine. Usually we have a war in the middle, and then we build again from the bottom of that. So the question is, over the next 30 years, are we going to avoid war as we shift from this mostly nation state model to a mostly global model over the next 30 years, 50 years, whatever? Are we able to do that without a war? Like I said, I think that's the question for the next 30 years.
Yeah, so essentially then we're at a real sort of point in history then, you would say, where this could end up in sort of a pretty full-scale conflict that would be potentially of no advantage to anyone in the short term, or it's where we get our heads together and come up with a solution. Is that kind of where we're at?
Pretty much, yeah. Yeah, it's an exciting time to be alive.
Wow. Lots to think about there. It's been a real pleasure to speak to you, and thanks ever so much for joining us. You can follow Mike on Twitter. I think it's @ThreshedThought, and details of his books will be on the end of this podcast. Thanks for joining us. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you very much. See ya.
Thank you. Take care. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Got Your Six Lads Advice Encounters with me, Gav Topley, and my guest, Dr. Mike Martin. This episode was recorded prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and so we weren't able to get Mike's take on that. But next week we will be speaking to the Master of Peterhouse College at Cambridge University, which is Ms. Bridget Kendall. Bridget is a former BBC correspondent and was the Moscow correspondent, and is a Russian speaker who has met several times with Putin. So that will be an interesting episode for next Sunday. Make sure you tune in for that. In the meanwhile, if you would like to get in touch with us, you can do so by all the usual routes: on Facebook, Lads Advice, by email, ladsadvice@hotmail.com, on Twitter, advice_lads, on Insta, lads_advice.
If you'd like to support our fundraiser for Papyrus Prevention of Young Suicide, please go to www.justgiving.com/fundraising/Chaz and Gav /Killy. And finally, if you'd like to support the group and the podcast, you can do so at patreon.com/Gav Topley. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.